Thank you all for coming. So we did this actually last year as well, and so the machine itself has actually been updated and it does a few new tricks that I'd like to show you guys. So if you look at this, what you are seeing up on the screen is what I'm looking at here. So imagine this is basically being like a big iPad. Functionality, it basically behaves the same way. Now, it's actually what we are seeing here, what you can see here, this is one screen here and this is one screen here. And to project this in full size like this, I would actually need another projector. So right now we'll just focus on the one side, right? But I can move this up and I can move this down. I can make her go up. I can rotate her in 360 degrees. We got this as a substitute because in Creeling Hall, also known as the Marshall Building, we used to actually dissect human bodies for one of our classes. And so it was a great experience. It was great. It really allowed the students to get involved and engaged. This does have some advantages over that since we've been using it. One thing it does is it certainly frees up a lot more time. I mean, if I wanted to remove the skin, all I have to do is remove this slider bar, and now the skin basically magically disappears. All right? And I can just scroll through all of the tissues like this, and then it goes from most superficial or towards the surface to deep. And we can keep going, we can keep scrolling through the tissues, and it'll remove more and more organs until you get down to what we're looking at here is just the circulatory system. Now, the human circulatory system is a lot more vast than this. This doesn't pick up a lot of blood vessels. So we can get, and we can add actually the nervous system, which you're able to see. You're able to see the central nervous system. That's the spinal cord right here, and this is the brain. And you're able to see some of the major nerves that come down the leg. Anyone know what the main nerve is that goes down the back of your leg? Many of you may have gone to the doctor or a physical therapist for this one. Yeah, if you heard of sciatica, that's usually something is off with this nerve, and it's not necessarily this nerve. A lot of times it actually is a problem with one of the nerve roots that make it up. Most commonly, either the L5 nerve root, yeah, you can't really write on this, or the last sacral, the first sacral nerve root. So let's undo this so we can move this again. Now I'm not sure how good some of the color comes out, but if I bring this up and magnify this, so the dark, thick vessels, that's your blood vessels. All right, the yellow ones are the nerves, and what you're going to see on that parallels your circulatory system, you're going to see these things right here, and you're going to see these delicate vessels that basically trace your circulatory system. Okay, so you can see them. They're pretty much all over. Wherever you have a circulatory system, you're going to have these. These are your lymphatic systems, and what their job is to do is to pick up any extra fluid that might have came out of your circulatory system. Your circulatory system works by who sits in the center of your circulatory system. Look at that beautiful illustration. There's the heart, right? So the heart is this driver of your circulatory system, and it's forcing, so we don't have the entire circulatory system shown here, but it creates pressure, and as that pressure, that forces some of the fluid out in between the blood vessels. And so if we want to reestablish and get that blood back into the circulatory system, right, we use those vessels. Now, there are conditions where these vessels become damaged. So if this vessel, this lymphatic vessel right here became damaged, what would happen is the fluid would not be able to get back into the circulatory system, and then the fluid would get trapped in the leg. Now, that results in very, very large deformities from swelling have you ever heard of something called lymphedema? So lymphedema is very common. One of the diagnoses it's very common in is women that had breast cancer. What's some of the treatments they often require? Right? So they might need to have, in just diagnosing, any of these vessels that go all over the body, your blood vessels, right? So if your blood vessels go throughout your body, if you have a abnormal cell that marches at its own drum, we'll call that a cancer cell, right? Cancers are cells that basically don't march to the same beat as the tissue they originate. They rapidly divide at their own drum. If that gets into circulation and then it basically embeds itself somewhere else, that one cell again becomes two becomes four, and it can continuously proliferate. So the way cancers spread, one of the ways is if they get in your circulatory system. The other way that we can identify whether a cancer has spread is if the cancer happened to be in your lungs over here, or your breast tissue has lots of lymphatics that are local to it. So what they will actually do is they'll look and explore some of the lymph nodes. And if all of your lymph nodes come out clean, there's less of a probability that it's probably spread into one of these systems. Because once you get into one of these systems that circulate throughout your body, that increases the probability that it can wind up somewhere else. So the two main ways that cancer can spread are through your bloodstream and your and your lymphatic system. So what often happens with women who have had a radical mastectomy, so if we add some tissue back, so you can see within the tissues themselves, right, the breast tissue itself would have all of these connections that would basically wind up going into some of these lymph nodes. And these lymph nodes are typically located in higher concentrations right as you're about to enter into important territory. What would be important territory? All of this is important territory. Why? That's where all your vital organs are. So if we look at the hip, what do we see? Lots of lymph nodes. Lots of lymph nodes. The axillary area, right? You're coming back from the extremity, lots of lymph nodes. But these can also feed into that. So when they examine those, that becomes very important as a prognostic indicator or a predictor whether they could potentially have a metastatic type of cancer. Okay, so let's put this guy back in place, or this female, sorry. All right, now one of the things that I used to have to use was scalpels to do my dissections. And so now I can use the mighty finger is more powerful than the scalpel. I can go like this, and then I can tap it, and then I turn, and now you can see where the slice was. So, and then I can basically move through this way and put her back together, or I can slice this way. What kind of medical images does this kind of look like? MRI. Yeah, this is what MRIs do. So MRIs are taken in what are known as the 3 cardinal planes. All right, so whenever we do a cut that separates the right side, there we go. Whenever we do a cut that separates the right side from the left side, that's my magic act. Let's just use the scalpel to demonstrate this. Whenever I do a cut that separates the right side from the left side, that's called the sagittal plane. And that allows you to see where everything is. And then so what an MRI scan will do is it'll take multiple images like this, and it'll slowly go through. Now, someone that's reading an MRI has to know where things are in relationship to each other in all the planes. So as we come through here, we can point out certain things, are pretty easy to point out. What do you think this big open thing is right here? Close, it's got an opening. And if I was able to flip it, it's sort of in the center. Right, so this is actually where your heart would be. Now, because the other lung has been pretty much cut out because we're somewhat in the center, right? So you might not see the lung because be, in this case, her left lung would have been on the other side, right? But this is where like the diaphragm would be, and that's what separates the abdominal from the thoracic cavity. So this is where the liver would be, and we can see actually parts of the stomach. You can tell this is part of the colon because, you know, what do you think that brown stuff is? Yeah, we don't need to go into that. Enjoy your food. Okay, good. So again, like, so this is very helpful. Now, if I was to scroll a little bit further, right, so now I'm closer to the right side, there are certain organs that we are going to be able to see. Now it changes the perception, or the perception of what we should be able to see. So this right here is the lung, and now you can really see the liver. And now because I'm more on the side, what do you think this thing is? Yeah, that's the kidney, right? So doctors have to be able to view this in multiple planes. So one way a doctor might need to view this, so you can cut someone into lefts and rights, or we can take our mighty scalpel again, and we can cut the person into front and back. Now what do we see? Now it's a lot easier to see the organs in relationship to each other. So let's take a look at the brain first. The brain is interesting. What's your brain made out of? Gray stuff, good. So the principal system that the brain is, so I'm going to draw it up here. Your brain is part of your nervous system. So your nervous system is a very important communication system in your body. It communicates what's going on in your environment via sensory type of neurons, sensory cells, and then it communicates a way to adjust to the environment, to do something. Those are motor neurons, and that allows you to move. That allows you to secrete certain oils, sweat, right? So that's the responding cells. So what a neuron typically looks like is, it looks like this, and this is the most rudimentary neuron, right? There we go. And so you've probably, has anyone ever seen this kind of illustration, right? So neurons communicate with each other. So one end of a neuron might communicate with another end of a neuron. So in the brain, you have lots of neurons that communicate with each other. Now, what we're seeing here is the large circular portion of the neuron. That's the cell body of the neuron. That's where the nucleus is. That's sort of like the command center. Now, if you imagine that being like the head of the neuron, those stringy-like, so imagine my hand being that part of the neuron. The hand is the cell body. The fingers represent these things called dendrites, and that allows these neurons to receive information from other neurons. So you can have the end of one neuron, which you can see represented by this Y-shaped thing. It would be sending its own chemical message, usually in the form of a neurotransmitter. And that will tell this neuron, do I want you to do something? So I'll just signify that as a positive. Or this one might be saying, no, don't do anything. And this neuron will then calculate and make a decision on whether to respond. So if you look at the long part of the neuron, all right, that part of the neuron would basically be like my arm. My arm would be what's called the axon of the neuron. So all the calculation is happening right where the cell body and the axon are meeting. Anyone know what covers the axons, what that's called? That would be like my sleeve. Have you ever heard of myelin? So myelin is this fatty insulation that allows you to increase the speed at which nerves can conduct. So what you're seeing here is whenever you're seeing the cell body and the dendrites, right? So that's the hairs that are coming off the head. That's where all the communication is happening. So what that's telling us is, guess what? All of this gray stuff that's where the cell bodies and the dendrites are located. But if I put my hands up here like this, what did we say my arm represented? What part of the nerve? That's that long axon. And those axons are long and they go to a certain place to transmit their message. Right? You have one, when we looked at the sciatic nerve before, that sciatic nerve begins over here. You have multiple nerve roots coming down, but all of this that then goes down the back of your leg, that's all the axon. All right? So the longest part of the biggest part of the cell is the axon. Okay? So what we're actually seeing here is, think of the brain, the way it's kind of set up with the gray tissue, which represents these axons, the cell body and the dendrites, that's in the gray.
We can't see that.
You have to push your...
We can't see the image.
Person.
What's that?
We can't see that.
Are you on the leg right now?
No. Oh, that's right. Oh yeah, I went down the leg before. I have to actually pretend the leg is here. It went down like that. Because if I eliminate this, then it won't let me move it. So in the next edition, hopefully they'll straighten out that kink. So if this was, so wherever you see the long part of nerves, we have these long nerves that go into your arms, that go to whatever they want to target, the muscles. It's always the axon that takes you there. So imagine the brain being sort of set up like the mall, okay? So here you are. You come into the mall and, I'm an Apple guy. So I come in right over here. This is where Barnes & Noble's is, right over here. I come in behind Barnes & Noble's. Everyone know where I am in the Smith Haven Mall? There might be a jewelry store over here, right? I come down. I'm walking down. If I'm communicating, I'm walking where the white is. The white it attracts. That's how I get to places. And then right in here, right over here is where the Apple store is, okay? So what happens in a store? That's where communication happens. That's where I'm saying, I want this. That's where I'm sending messages. That's where, they're responding. So that's like the two nerves interacting with each other. So decisions are made. So what that tells us is decisions are made out here. But then, what can also happen? I can have another, if I wanted to leave, how do I leave? Well, the part that actually communicates, that goes distance, that's where the axons come in. And what covers the axon is this sheath that covers it called the myelin. So myelin is typically, that's white. So wherever you're seeing white here, what you're really seeing are these are all of the axons. And this, for example, this line right that's coming from one side of the brain to the other, it's called the corpus callosum. It's just a track of axons that allow the two sides of the brain to communicate with each other. Now you come out of the Apple store and you might find another little brown spot here, and it's a little one. It's called a nuclei. That might be the annoying guy trying to sell you an iPhone case, those little kiosks, right? But wherever you're seeing white, that's typically where the axons are. Now, when we look at patients who might have certain medical conditions that go after myelin, like multiple sclerosis, they will look for interruptions in the myelin, and it looks like plaque. And so if the color looks disrupted, how does it affect the person? Well, it affects the person depending on what part of the brain we're looking at. So let's close out of this. Let's put this guy together. Let's put her together. Let's remove everything except the brain and the, we'll keep everything else. We'll make everything else go away. Let's see. All right. So now, when we look at the brain, we can look and see which is the front of the brain and which is the back of the brain. So we can tell which is the front of the brain versus which is the back of the brain. Let's remove some of this other stuff to make it a little bit easier to see. Okay? This is the front of the brain right here. Okay? Now, the front of your brain is very important, especially if you're a student, or especially if you want to basically be able to communicate with people and not get people really mad. All right, the front of your brain, it's known as your prefrontal cortex. It controls everything that allows you to really socialize in your environment. It's a major controller of personality. This is the part of the brain that allows you to do the hard thing, like delayed gratification. So one of the things, there's an interesting study that they did with children where they tested children. It was called the marshmallow study, where they took children, I believe they were 4 years old, and they left them in a room with the marshmallow, and they said, if you eat this marshmallow, you won't get another marshmallow. But if you don't eat this marshmallow, if you just hold it, we'll give you 2 marshmallows. So there's a reward for waiting. And they found that the children that waited wound up later, when they followed them years later, wound up doing better in a lot of these academic type setting. They wound up being more successful in life because even at a young age, they had this this ability to delay gratification. Now, this is the last part of the brain that actually fully develops. And when we say fully develops, it's the last part of the brain that actually fully myelinates. So as myelin forms, it's around the age of 25 that we actually get full myelination, which this is why, for those who have children, this is why they do stupid things sometimes, right? And you intuitively, when you do something stupid, what do? Right? You don't rabbit punch yourself. You intuitively know to hit yourself in the front of the brain. Okay? Now, as you come back, now the brain is kind of set up where we can draw a line right down the middle of the brain, right through here. So from here we said the front part of the brain, this was important for decision making, higher thought, higher cognitive function. So the type of activities that will encourage that are any activity that encourages you to do the hard thing. So we have a lot of things that interfere with really maximizing this part of the brain, really encouraging this part of the brain. And when we talk about how do we encourage your brain to work better, the way your brain is wired is the frequency at which you use certain parts of your brain, the more you use a certain part of the brain, the stronger those wired connections are going to be. And that brain will have a preference towards those connections. So what does that mean? If this area of the brain is all about doing the hard thing, so how many of you have on your phone, you have it where it beeps when you get a message or you get a text message? One of the things that they find now is people do what? They almost like reflexively, how many of you get a little anxiety? You want to know what it says. You want to know that text message because you get a little bit of dopamine release, that there's this anticipation of some kind of a reward. When was the last time Ed McMahon in a message told you you're going to be a millionaire, right? But if you wait, if you challenge your brain to wait, you're actually working on this area of the brain. Do the hard thing. One of the things that increases the power of this kind of the brain, or this part of the brain, is meditation, believe it or not. Why? Anytime you have to focus is a key function of this area of the brain. So if you can focus, you're strengthening the wires of this part of the brain. And we'll talk about the other part of the brain that will actually get in the way of your ability to focus. Does that make sense? I mean, think about it. You could tell how well wired you are. How many of you can actually sit there and meditate for, say, more than 2 minutes without thinking about, what am I having for dinner? What am I going to do tomorrow? Right? It's very difficult, and that's why it takes practice, because you have to take the time to literally remodel. It's called neuroplasticity. What you do will actually change how your brain works itself, how it wires itself. I used to be a physical therapist, so as a physical therapist, if someone had, where'd you go? If someone had a stroke, right, I can tell, let's do it this way, here we go. If someone had a stroke, let's make this bigger. in this area of the brain right here, this part of the brain is what controls the face, right? Now, this part, this line right here, from here to here, all of body movements is able to occur right in this area of the brain. So down here is where the face is, and as you go further up, you get closer to the feet. And at the same time, this is where the face is sensory-wise. So once we go into the back part of the back part of the brain is generally wired for your ability to see things, or perception, or feeling. It's all sensory. So your ability to see, if someone had a stroke that affected this back part of the brain, this back part of the brain is called the occipital lobe, and that's where your primary vision is. So if someone had a stroke that damaged that, they wouldn't be able to see, or their seeing might be altered depending on how it was affected. If someone had a part of the stroke that affected this whole area of the brain, it would drastically affect their face, because we just said that. It would affect the muscles that control speech, so they won't be able to speak. But guess what? The hearing is right over here, and some of the receptive areas for understanding language is over here, so you might wind up not being able to understand speech. That's what we call aphasia. You have one where you can't speak, you can't express yourself. We call that an expressive aphasia because it's in the front of the brain. That affects the motor function, versus a receptive aphasia, which is more the back of the brain, which is your understanding. Listening to someone speak, hearing what they're saying, and interpreting language is a sensory experience. Does that make sense? I'm getting all technical on you guys with using a lot of terms that, if you haven't had anatomy, I just want to make sure I'm not completely losing you. Now, how many of you guys have problems with memory, right? Well, an important area of your brain for memory is this area, the temporal lobe, okay? So you got hearing, this is an important part for hearing, so it makes sense that where you have hearing and memory go hand in hand. But the temporal lobe is very important for memory, and we'll talk about some things that you can do to actually improve your memory. Part of the reason that we tend to not remember things like, where did I leave my keys, or where did I park my car? If you have that, that does not mean, oh no, I've got Alzheimer's disease. When you start to worry about this person might have Alzheimer's disease is, what are keys for? Or what is that? So, what usually happens, and we see this, and as we get older, it's not that necessarily our memory is necessarily getting bad. We just become less mindful of what we do. We are multitasking, and our brain is really not wired to multitask. So when you come in the house, you might just throw your keys and not even think twice about it. And then 2 hours later, when you have to get out for a meeting, now you don't remember that you threw your keys, and now you're basically searching throughout every place. You're ripping apart your furniture. Not that I speak from experience. Not at all. So, now, I do want you to notice that the brain itself has, you notice the outside, it's all twisted and convoluted. There's a common theme in anatomy. Whenever you have lots of twists and folds and convolutions, it's all to maximize how much tissue you can pack in a certain area. It's to give it more surface area. So the cortex in the cerebrum is designed that way. So this is the latest, this is the most evolved part of your brain. As we turn it into the inside, and let me just scroll a little bit through here and here, try to get it right in the middle. Okay. What you'll notice is towards the center of the brain, we can see this back structure right here. This is really an important structure for balance and coordination. It's called your cerebellum. And your cerebellum, you can see, guess what? You see the white matter? And what do you see more of, white or gray tissue in the cerebellum? It actually has white that kind of looks like a tree, and they actually call it the arbe vitae, which means tree of life. That's one hideous looking tree. But, so what did we say the white matter was again? What part of the nerve?
Axons.
That was the axons, right? Covered with the myelin. And the gray matter is what? That's all where the decisions are being made. So lots of decisions are being made there. The cerebellum has to it takes information that's coming up from your spinal cord, where your body is in space. We call that proprioception. And a lot of that information is telling your cerebellum where you are in space right now, and it has to communicate with what you want to do, which comes down from the upper side. So it's comparing what you want to do to what you can do. So if someone had a stroke that affected their cerebellum, guess what their main dysfunction would be? They'd have significant problems with any kind of motivation, or not motivation, coordination. They wouldn't be able to walk very effectively. When we think about how effortless it is to walk, someone with a cerebellar lesion, that becomes very difficult. Or to reach for something, that is a very challenging act. For someone with a cerebellum, the movements just become real jerky. They don't know how to control that movement. So that's what we know. The new thing that we're learning about the cerebellum, it doesn't just coordinate your movements, but it actually plays a role in coordinating your thoughts. So the reason that I bring this up is there's a whole body of evidence now that's showing that exercise has been shown to improve cognitive function dramatically. There's a pretty good book that really goes through and explains a lot of this. It's called Spark by John J. Ratley. I'm not sure about the J, but it's called Spark. And they actually took a high school in, I think it was Indiana, and they had this group was one of the last in the county, and then they changed the way they did gym class, where the traditional model where, you know, you had the kids basically doing certain clusters, and then certain of the non-athletic kids would be intimidated and not want to work because they didn't want to have to compete. They made it so no one competed with each other. They all had their own exercise regimen. And it actually took them to the top of the states in many of their cognitive scores, both English and math, which are real important. Well, why is that? When you challenge your balance and coordination in your body, what kind of things might challenge balance and coordination in the body? Sitting on the couch eating bonbons? Or like playing racquetball, where I'm moving side to side, right? So any kind of exercise where you're challenging your body to move is going to increase this. Anytime you're increasing the brain's activity in a specific area, what are we doing? There's that neuroplasticity, it's going to strengthen. But it also is strengthening your ability to think. So exercise has been shown to be as effective as an antidepressant as some of these selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, without a lot of the side effects. Plus you get a lot of the other benefits that exercise does. So, okay, so let's take a look. Let's bring back the body. That's very nice. Let's bring back the rest of our. Oh, if we wanted to, actually, one of the tools that this has is we have a tool where I can actually create a opening. So I created a circle there. If I tap that circle, this is running on a Windows 7 computer. So, like computers, what are you used to seeing? Right? You're used to that delay. So what did it just do? What are we seeing now? You're seeing the top of the scalp, right? So if I touch that, now I start seeing the bones. If I touch this, now I get down to the brains. So this is something that I need to teach my students, because, you know, the two primary courses that I use to teach with this is the Bio 246, which is a anatomy for the physical therapy assistant students, and Bio 245, which is kinesiology, which is for our fitness specialist students, where they need to know the muscles. So I have to be able to show them that in detail. But what did I do? I just did a whole lobectomy. I don't recommend you guys having one. All right? Because again, we removed the frontal lobe. How is that going to affect the person? Right? It's going to affect their behavior. Have you guys ever heard of Phineas Gage? Right? Phineas Gage, he was a railroad worker that had one of those railroad spikes shoot up through his head, and it affected the front part of his head. You know, much of what we know about the brain is from the misfortune of others. You know, before MRIs and before, you know, all of these different functional MRIs which can measure blood flow and measure metabolic activity, and then we can kind of imply certain functions, we looked at, well, if this area of the brain was damaged, then, and we saw this deficit after, that might means it must control this. Here's a really nice view. Again, you can see what? You can see the gray on the ear, and then look at all this white, right? That means the cell body and the dendrites would have been here, and then the axons would be going somewhere from there. So what we will do now is, why don't we take a look at the male. One of the most common places that, and this was not exactly a nice time in human, let's just say this was not a nice time in human medicine and learning, was the Nazis actually did a lot of experiments on the people who they captured, and they would literally just lesion a part of the brain and see what the effect was. And it's a horrible way to learn, but you know, that was their answer of speeding up the process. We have a lot of other tools now, like spectrometry and functional MRIs that we can learn. Plus, we have much experience with seeing people who damage themselves, whether it having a cerebral vascular accident, or if the person's lungs became damaged. When you think of someone's lungs, what do you think of the primary functions of your lungs is? What's their job? Why do you have lungs? What's that?
Get rid of carbon dioxide.
Get rid of carbon dioxide, good. And what do we want to get into the system? We want to get oxygen into the system. So what we can do is, why don't we just start removing, we don't need skin, so we'll turn that off. So we don't need muscles. You guys want to get rid of the muscles? Yeah, let's get rid of the muscles. We'll turn the muscles off. Okay. I do want to show you this. Now this is actually interesting. This fat right here, this fat here, so let's bring everything back for a second. So we'll bring the nerves in. Okay. Now, if I was to cut through this person, now he doesn't have nearly as much, but you see this yellow stuff right here and here, and there's some here. He doesn't have too much. What do you think that is? Yeah, that's fat, exactly. Okay? Now, when someone has a lot of fat that's on, this is his abdominal muscles right here. When the fat is on the outside here, that's the fat that you can grab, right? That's the fat that hangs over, okay? That's what we call visceral fat, okay? If you have fat on the inside, so let's turn the muscles off, and we'll turn the skin off. This is the fat on the inside. Now, what's the problem with this fat? Can you get liposuction for this fat? Right? This fat, if you have a lot of this fat, so let's say I was as thin as I am, and you've seen people who are as thin as I am, and when you look at their stomach, what does it look like? If they have a lot of fat right here. You could be a guy and you can look pregnant. Why do they look pregnant? They look pregnant because it's inside their body cavity. So as that fat expands, the more fat that you get, it becomes, that fat itself becomes a space-occupying lesion. It starts taking up space. And as it's taking up space, what is it pushing down on? All of your organs, exactly. So so this is called your greater omentum. And it does have some roles. You know, it does act as an insulator, all right? We tend to, again, fat is a good thing from an evolutionary standpoint. The reason that we've developed fat is because we haven't had always in nature 4 boxes of pizza in the back readily at our advantage, right? We were hunters and gatherers, so we can go long periods of time and we can get a lot more calories out of fat. So if I start taking the fat away, what is it compressing? Well, what are these stringy, like wormy-like structures that are deep down in there? Anyone know what that is? They look, these things right here. They're kind of going all over the place. That's your small intestines, right? So, all right, so what could be the effect of compressing your, so now you can really see the small intestines. All right, you guys see that? So food is supposed to come in from your mouth. It comes down. So you chew on the food. What's that tube that it comes down? The esophagus. And it ends up right here. That's where your stomach is. Now your stomach is much larger than this, and then it's supposed to get fed through your small intestines until it winds up in your large intestine. But if you had a lot of fat, what would that be doing to your small intestines? You could see how it would put a lot of pressure on your small intestines, but it's not just that you're putting pressure on. People that have a lot of that visceral fat, so let's remove some of this. You see this big blood vessel right here? Who's the biggest blood vessel in the body? Ever hear of your aorta? When you put pressure on this, who has to work harder? The heart. That's what we call hypertension. That'll cause hypertension. So imagine if the opening of the aorta is supposed to be like this, right? The heart's job is to pump the blood throughout the circulatory system like this, but we've got something putting more pressure on the artery itself. That pressure can be either from stress, because what stress actually does is it makes the artery smaller. So if you have the same volume of blood, but the vessels get smaller, right, the pressure is going to be higher. The heart itself is going to have to work harder. And so here's the outline of a normal heart, or of this person's heart. The heart is like any other tissue. If we make, so let me get rid of some of these drawings so I can we can actually make the bones become a little bit more transparent. Okay? Good. Now, you can see the heart through the bones a little bit better. If the heart is, what kind of, anyone know what the heart's made out of? What kind of, like, so if you had a choice, it contracts, what other thing contracts in the body? Muscle. So the heart is its own unique type of muscle. So whenever you work a muscle harder, what's it going to wind up doing?
Harder.
Right? So does it increase or decrease in size? It increases in size. Well, that sounds like a good thing. You got a big heart, you got a lot of love to give, right? But what happens as it gets bigger, it gets thicker, and the problem with that, it doesn't just get bigger from the outside, it kind of, the openings where the blood actually goes on the inside actually gets smaller. So now you can get less blood in the heart. At the same time, if you've got this thicker heart muscle, when we want to fill up the heart, it doesn't stretch the way we want it to. And plus, because it's bigger, is that going to require more or less oxygen and nutrients? It's going to require more. So this is all a bad combination. So chronic hypertension from whatever it is, whether it's stress, whether it's people who have a lot of visceral fat, a lot of them may be carrying people's blood pressure. I've seen people's blood pressure drop very quickly after they say gave up soda, they gave up the sugar, all of a sudden they lost that belly fat, that their blood pressure is normalized, and then they got off a lot of the medications. So all of these systems, you know, we talk about these, you know, when I'm teaching this the challenging thing is I'm teaching the most basic, I have to teach all of these systems one at a time. And the challenging part is how do I teach to show they don't function autonomously or independently, but they all function in collaboration with each other. So when the heart is working correctly, it's able to deliver the oxygen to the tissues, and then the tissues are, can then do what they need to do. Like you have a muscle here, and that muscle needs lots of oxygen to do its work, and it needs to get rid of all of its CO2, so then we have our veins that we can take it back to the other side of the heart, which then sends it to the lungs. And so all of these systems have to be working. Now, if you had something called emphysema, where your lung tissue itself, what winds up happening is, instead of your air sacs being nice and numerous, and wherever you see a red line, this is like what a cross section, it's a cross section of your, what are called your alveoli. Wherever you see red, that's where gas is exchanged. So in someone with emphysema, you might see something that looks more like this, right? You see a lot more open spaces, a lot less of the red walls, which means you're not able to get in as much oxygen because you have less surface area. But what else can't you get rid of? You can't get rid of the CO2. So that's something that, so we can predict what are the symptoms that patients are going to have just based on knowing the fundamental understandings of what the various organs do. So let's look at some common pathologies. So what we have here are some examples. What's the first one we'll do? Let's do... Anyone want to dissect out a dog? We'll save that one. So, since we're talking about the lungs...
When you were saying stress before, were you just talking about the stress of the fat or thought stress?
Both. Because the fat stress, the fat puts stress on the body. Believe it or not, visceral fat actually releases chemicals. One of the things that we know about heart disease and most chronic diseases is there's a link with inflammation, and certain types of tissue release certain inflammatory chemicals. So you can relate that to being a stress. But thought stress, that turns on this division of your nervous system. It's called your fight or flight system, right? It's called your sympathetic nervous system. And when that is on, your body doesn't, it pretty much shuts down all higher cognitive functions. It's all about fighting or fleeing, right? So the parts of the brain that are involved in, the critical decision making, that frontal lobe that we talked about, they kind of go in the back burner because your body goes into, I need a short-term solution to get me away from this. So it becomes more reflexive. It tends to go to more reflexive parts of the brain. And that helps explain why students, when they have stress anxiety, what happens? All of this hard work that they've done, they now basically lose it, right? Because when they become stressed, they're basically, that stress response can interfere with all of those long-term plans, because when you're under stress, your body's all about short-term solutions. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
What we are looking at here are, this is what a cystic fibrosis lung looks like. Now, what normal lungs will typically look like is they will have a lot of, you see all of that white? All of that white is mucus and fluid built up, all right? So all of that mucus, that interferes with the lung's ability to do what two things? Get what into the body, right? We can't get oxygen into the blood, and then what can't we get rid of? You can't get rid of your CO2. So these people will typically need to be on some kind of supportive oxygen therapy. They actually have vests that they wear that shake them, and that shaking them helps break up the mucus, and they'll need to take medication to help break up the mucus. They've gotten a lot better with this, with treating these kind of things. Let's look at another cool image. So, So before, I spoke to you guys about the perils of that high blood pressure. Another thing that causes your blood vessels to constrict, which puts a lot of stress on your heart, smoking. Smoking is a big one. Now, does anyone see anything in here that might look a little bit abnormal? Anyone know? So what I want you guys to focus on is this thing right here. Anyone know what vessel that is? And don't look at that right there. Right, so this is what's known as an aortic aneurysm. Now, a lot of times, the aorta, this part of the aorta right here, this is your abdominal aorta. So you might have heard people refer this as a triple A. What that stands for is it's an abdominal aortic aneurysm. You see that bulge right there? Why do you think that bulge had developed? Well, would you expect that to develop in conditions of low or higher blood pressure over time? Higher. So imagine, like, you know, putting higher pressure through a garden hose. What's that garden hose going to do over time? It's going to start to stretch. It's going to start to give. Right? So chronic hypertension, and we often see it right at the point where the blood has to make a decision. Do I want to go into the right leg or the left leg? Why? Because there's always a little bit more back pressure, and that back pressure typically happens at the point where the blood splits. We see that also happen in the brain. So when someone has something like this develop, what's the concern? The concern is, you know, if you rupture your aorta, that blood vessel's under such high pressure that they're going to bleed out very quick. You can have them on a hospital operating room table, and they might not survive that. Does that make sense? So, let's take a look at another pathology. Anyone here want to do surgery? So, let me have my surgeon come up.
Nobody's worried. I'll do it. Go to the hell. I'm going to watch you. I'm going to watch you come up there.
Killing animation.
Yeah, be
Okay.
careful on the
Yeah, so
steps
just
here.
watch some
Just
of
gotta look
the
them up close. Yeah.
wires over here. All right, so let me put this person. So what you're tasked to do, you can't do any damage. If I haven't damaged it yet, you're going to be just fine. What I would like you to do is you have to separate Siamese twins.
Oh, okay.
All right?
Gotcha.
So, everyone see that? So, she's got the task to separate the, so, exactly. So what you need to do is you have to touch the scalpel. All right, so now so you take your finger. Now, the key is you draw a line straight down where you want it to go.
Okay.
All right? And then you keep your finger on it the whole time. Now, here's the important part. You have to touch the baby that you don't want to keep.
I guess that's
So,
the one.
so that was the baby she wanted to get rid of. And there you go. Was that horrible?
Yeah.
All right, but you can bring it back.
Bring it back, yeah.
You can go this way, the baby comes back. But what are you able to see? You can see all the vertebrae, right? We come back. Look, you can see, I don't know if you guys can see this right here. Do you see all the little, this is the lungs, and you can see all of those little tree-like structures that are going out? Those are going out into the various lung tissues. So those are your various vessels that then feed those air sacs that we spoke about. So there's the heart
Oh, there
right
it
there.
is.
See that?
Yeah, right
You can
there.
see the outline of it.
Are they
So-
sharing a heart? I guess they are.
Well, they actually had their own heart.
They did, okay.
Yeah. So here's this one's heart, because we're not through yet, because you can actually see this is the front part of the first one's rib cage.
Gotcha.
This is that person's liver. This is the person's aorta.
Yeah.
Okay, you can see the
Oh, that's where it
kidneys.
splits.
There's where it's split. And you can see some of the intestines.
I could teach this now.
You could. My students would appreciate that, believe me, because I'm sure they're sick of me now.
No. This is
Okay.
fascinating.
So, and now we're into the other body. And now you can kind of see.
Yep.
So let's see what else we have here.
When did you get this?
We got this about a year ago.
Oh, wow, it's pretty new.
All right. Who else did you want to dissect?
No, I just can see better from here than
Yeah.
you can see on that. I just wanted to see what the difference was.
Yeah, you guys can come up if you want to look at it from close-up.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And you go out of the way.
And we can actually probably maybe turn the light on. Yeah. Thanks, Rebecca.